The wind over eastern France carried the smell of rain and war. It was November 27, 1944, and the gray morning light found Lieutenant General George S. Patton pacing outside his headquarters in Nancy, boots caked in mud, his ever-present ivory-handled pistols glinting faintly beneath his coat. His Third Army had fought its way through France, across the Moselle, and now stood along the flooded Saar River, pressing toward Germany's border. The offensive had slowed to a crawl, supply lines stretched thin, rivers swollen, and every field turned to a bog. But today was not about battle. Patton was preparing to host a visitor, a man whose report would travel straight to Joseph Stalin himself. That visitor was Averell Harriman, the United States ambassador to the Soviet Union. He had come from Reims, where he'd met with General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Western Europe. Eisenhower wanted Harriman to see the front with his own eyes, to understand what American soldiers endured as they fought through mud, cold, and constant German resistance. And he wanted Stalin to hear it from someone who had stood in that same rain. Harriman arrived at 10 a.m., accompanied by British Lieutenant Colonel James Galt, Eisenhower's aide. He found Patton waiting beside a modified M20 scout car, an armored vehicle customized to the general's taste. The heavy .50 caliber machine gun mount had been replaced with a centered post mount. A polished windshield gleamed with droplets of rain, and metal flags bearing Patton's 3 stars fluttered against the wind. Mounted air horns, Patton's preferred herald, were ready to announce his arrival anywhere he went. Without ceremony, Patton climbed aboard, Harriman and Galt following, and the convoy rolled toward the front lines. The road to the Saar was a churned wasteland of mud, trucks, and rain. Artillery boomed in the distance, convoys of half-tracks, and Shermans moved in both directions, their treads carving deep scars into the soaked earth. At one point, Harriman leaned out to watch a line of African-American gunners manning anti-aircraft weapons along the roadside, their faces streaked with grime but their posture proud. The ambassador was silent for a long while. It was clear to him why Eisenhower wanted him here, to witness not just the strategy, but the hardship that defined every mile. Patton, however, was in his element. The mud, the chaos, the roar of engines, all of it seemed to fuel him. He stood upright in the scout car, scanning the horizon like a cavalryman from another age. "The Germans may have the ground," he said over the wind, "but we have the guts." Harriman could see why the men followed him so fiercely. There was an energy around Patton, a contagious drive that turned misery into motion. Their first stop was Mittersheim, 36 miles south of Sarreguemines, where the 4th Armored Division was positioned under Major General Jack P. Wood. The weather worsened as they arrived, low clouds, driving rain, and a wind that carried the chill of winter. Patton dismounted and immediately began his inspection. Spotting one of Wood's officers, he barked, "How many tanks are you short?" The officer replied, 13 medium tanks, sir." Patton's eyes flashed. "We're not short 13 medium tanks in the whole United States Army," he snapped. His chief of staff, General Hugh Gaffey, quickly intervened, explaining that the figure included tanks undergoing overhaul. Patton grunted, half smiling, and waved it off. Moments later, Wood himself appeared, wrapped in a greatcoat, sniffling from a heavy cold. Even so, he led his guests through the positions, pointing out artillery emplacements, logistics depots, and tank maintenance areas. Rain fell harder, turning the paths into miniature rivers. Patton stopped often to speak with soldiers, his boots sinking deep into the muck. When he came upon a chow line, men standing in the open with rainwater splashing into their mess kits, he asked one, "How's the food, son?" The soldier looked up, water dripping from his helmet. "Fine, sir, fine." Patton grinned. That's the spirit. For Harriman, the scene was transformative. He had read reports from the front, but they had never conveyed the reality, the ceaseless labor, the exhaustion, the quiet discipline of men fighting through weather and fatigue. He saw in Patton not the caricature of the brash general so often described in Washington, but a man entirely devoted to his army, moving through mud and misery as naturally as through a parade ground. They pressed onward, crossing a Bailey Bridge over the Saar under Wood's escort. The river below had overflowed its banks, swallowing fields and roads alike. Patton pointed to the vast sheets of water and said dryly, "Every field is a lake, a fine place for amphibious warfare." He gestured toward a hastily dug German anti-tank ditch nearby. "That trench," he remarked, "isn't worth a damn." The ambassador laughed. Patton's contempt for enemy engineering was unmistakable. Farther along, the roar of artillery grew louder. Patton stopped near a battery firing across the river. Shells screamed overhead, their smoke drifting through the rain. He shouted brief words of praise to the gunners, then motioned for the convoy to move on toward the 26th Infantry Division under Major General Willard Paul. There, in a field of soaked earth and broken trees, Harriman witnessed a scene he would never forget. A group of exhausted infantrymen stood clustered around Patton's vehicle, mud plastered to their uniforms, helmets dull with rain. They were waiting to be relieved, their eyes hollow from days without rest. Patton climbed down, his voice cutting through the wind. "Men," he called, pointing toward a rise in the distance. "If you can make it to the top of that hill before the next outfit moves in, it will make a hell of a difference." There was a murmur among them. Tired disbelief. Patton continued, "I know what you've been through. I know you've fought like hell. But one more push, just one, will make it easier for the next men who take your place." His tone softened, then sharpened again. "You've done great work. Now finish the job." For a moment, no one moved. Then, almost as if compelled by something larger than themselves, the men rose. A few shouted, "Let's go!" and began trudging uphill through the mud. Harriman watched in silence as the small figures disappeared into the mist. "He knows exactly when to give them hell," he murmured, "and when to give them hope." At the next stop, Patton presented the Distinguished Service Cross to a lieutenant who had forced a crossing of the Saar under fire. The soldiers gathered around as he pinned the medal to the man's chest. "You've all done a great job," he told them, his voice loud over the wind. "A lot of you sons of bitches may have deserved this medal, but don't grouse that he got it and you didn't. Do the same job again, and another one of you will get it, then." In a rare moment of introspection, Patton added, "It's the greatest honor anybody can get. I'd rather have it than eternal life." Harriman took notes quietly, his gloved hand shaking from the cold. Here was leadership unlike any he had seen in diplomacy or politics, direct, personal, almost primal. Patton's energy seemed inexhaustible. When they reached the river again, the general abruptly stopped and announced, "I'm going to get my feet wet," before anyone could respond. He strode down to the edge, stepped into the freezing water, and waded out until it reached his knees. "Now Stalin can't say I didn't know what mud looks like," he shouted back, half laughing. Everywhere they went, Patton stopped to speak with engineers, artillerymen, medics, drivers, anyone in uniform. He asked if they'd received the blankets he'd sent forward, whether their rations were warm, if they were getting enough sleep. His tone shifted between gruffness and humor, but the sincerity was unmistakable. Harriman saw soldiers stand straighter when Patton spoke to them. To the ambassador, it was as if the general carried the entire army's morale in his voice. On their way back toward Nancy, they passed through the 4th Armored Division again. Along a muddy road stood a Sherman tank, its gun barrel blackened from combat, surrounded by the twisted remains of 5 German Panzer Harfus. Patton ordered the convoy to stop. He climbed down and examined the wrecks, rain dripping from his helmet brim. "Get me a camera," he said, and began taking photographs himself, one of the few moments he let curiosity overtake command. Major General Wood rejoined them there and pointed out that the tank's commander, a young lieutenant, was its only surviving crewman. Patton nodded solemnly, then called the man forward and awarded him the Distinguished Service Cross on the spot. The lieutenant, his face pale with exhaustion, described how he had knocked out 2 enemy tanks at 100 yards and then charged into 3 more, destroying them at 50. "A very great piece of fighting," Patton said quietly. Harriman agreed. He had just witnessed the character of the American soldier, determined, inventive, and utterly fearless. That evening, back at headquarters, Patton changed into a fresh uniform, but kept his muddy boots. Harriman joined him for dinner, where the conversation turned to Moscow. The ambassador spoke candidly about Stalin, his strength, his cunning, his ruthlessness. He could threaten the peace we're fighting to win, Harriman warned. Patton listened, polishing the rim of his helmet with a cloth. Maybe, he said, but at least he knows courage when he sees it. Harriman smiled, recalling how Stalin had once praised Patton's dash across France, saying that even the Red Army could not have conceived such a maneuver. The compliment stayed with Patton all night. Later, he wrote in his diary, "I may get a Red Star yet." For Harriman, the day had been more than a tour. It was revelation. He had seen the American army not as numbers or reports, but as living, breathing men fighting in conditions that defied endurance. And he had seen the man who led them, flawed, volatile, but utterly devoted to victory. When he returned to Moscow, he would speak not just of strategies or supply lines, but of spirit, of mud, and of the unbreakable will that drove the Allied advance into Germany.